My name is David Schlub, and I've been working in the violin shop for, I think, 43 years now. And in this episode of VIVO edu, we're going to talk about instrument care. And the parts of a violin are actually very similar to the parts of a human body. We're going to start here at the top, and this is the head of the violin. It's also called the scroll because you can see the wood looks like it's rolled up like a scroll of paper, but it's often called the head. The other part of the violin coming out of the head, we have two ears, I suppose, but here we have four pegs. And this is what allows us to tune the instrument. So by turning these right or left, you're going to raise or lower the pitch. And below that, we're going to have the neck. And then if you look at the rest of the violin, you've got a belly and you've got a back. And just like a human, what keeps your belly from touching your back? It's the ribs. So on the side we have a set of ribs. Now on the top you'll also notice two holes. These are called the F holes because they're shaped a little bit like an F. There's one on each side, and we're going to look in a minute about what's inside those. But that's the basic anatomy of a violin. These are all individual pieces of wood. They're not bent or pressed out. They're all carved individually. Now, if we look at the inside of a violin, you'll see this little stick. And this is called the sound post. But I was thinking about, okay, what part of the anatomy does that relate to? And I would call this the heart of the violin. Because when we think about the sound vibrating the top of the instrument, it's actually pulsating. It moves up and down, it moves the post up and down, and it transfers those vibrations to the back. So it really kind of acts like your heart pumping blood through your body. Now there's one other part that I don't think we can see here, so I'm going to grab another violin top. We had this long piece of wood. This is called the bass bar. And so I think this is like the spine of the violin. It provides a rigid support for the entire top of the violin. And when we think about the pressures on a violin, if we didn't have this bass bar, the top of the violin would start to cave in. If you didn't have a spine, you couldn't stand up. So that's what I'd call the spine of the violin. Otherwise, there's not a lot of magic going on the inside of the violin. This is the only little parts on the inside. What makes a violin sound good or bad might be the dimensions, the thicknesses, the type of wood, but pretty much all violins are built the same way with the same parts. And as far as the parts of the violin, you're going to find out you have exactly the same parts in a viola or a cello or a bass. They're just bigger. The one thing about the bass is it usually doesn't have the wooden pegs. It's got gears, which makes it much easier to tune, and an instrument that happens to stay in tune a lot better than a violin. Otherwise, the parts are the same. A bow is fairly simple in terms of the parts. When we think about a violin and all the parts to a violin, the bow is a piece of wood that starts out, well, this is one that's already started, and you can see how rough this is, but you'll also notice that it's just a straight piece of wood. It's a little thicker here where we have the tip of the bow, called the tip. And at the other end of the bow, we have something for, I don't know what reason, but it's called the frog. And the hair is attached to the tip, and it's attached to the frog, but the frog moves back and forth on the bow. And it does that so that we can tension the hair. When you're done practicing, you should always relax the tension on the bow so that the hair doesn't have to be this loose, but we don't want tension on the stick. Now, if you notice this stick, it's not straight like the one I just showed you. It has a bend in it. When the bow maker makes the bow, he actually makes it straight. It doesn't have a bend in the beginning. And the bend is, in fact, bent in. It is not carved in. So you can imagine this piece of wood grew to be straight. It wants to be straight. And if we leave it straight all the time by not relaxing the tension, we're going to lose that bend in the stick, and the bend is very important. So that's why we always loosen the bow. At this end, you've just got a screw here. I'm going to pull this apart so you can see how it works. So the frog, not glued to the stick either, it's got a little slot in there. There's a little brass eyelet here which allows the frog to slide back and forth in that slot and either tension or relax the hair on the bow. You might ask, how tight should the bow be? Well, obviously you can't play with it that way. What I usually tell people, and this is a pretty safe rule of thumb, it doesn't work for every bow, and it certainly doesn't necessarily work for the bass bow. But when the hair is relaxed but not completely loose like I just showed you, if you put a pencil or a pen in there, it's going to stay in there. Now as we tighten the bow and pull the frog backward, we're going to lose some of that curve in the stick. So if you tighten that up until the pen falls out, that's going to be about the right tension to play with. Now I could keep tightening here, and that would be bad. Bad things are going to happen. So when we have the bow and we look at it this way, it still has that smile shape. If I tightened it up so much that it was straight across or even frowning, a good chance we're going to break the bow. We can imagine that the hair, which this is horsehair, is actually quite strong. If you were to weave a rope from this, you could probably hang from it. There's no way you're hanging from this little stick of wood. So the hair is much stronger than the wood. If you over tighten the bow, you can break the stick. If you leave the bow tight and it falls off a stand or something, a table, it's probably going to break. So when I tell kids, you know, what do you do if you're practicing and the phone rings? They'll say, answer the phone. I said, no, you loosen your violin bow and then you answer the phone. It's that important. Something you should never forget to do. Why do we have horsehair in bows? I don't know. I suppose the horse must have ran by a guitar one time, made a noise, and somebody said, oh, that's... I have no idea. However, you know, when you think back 400 or 500 years, you probably didn't have too many options. The horsehair by itself is pretty strong. Individually, you know, you could break a hair quite easily, but there's about 150 hairs in a violin bow, give or take. And combined, they make a pretty strong band of hair. The hair itself, though, is quite smooth, and if you tried to play a violin without putting rosin on it, you actually wouldn't get any sound at all. It'd be silent. So the hair is only, its job really is to hold on to the rosin, which the rosin plays your instrument. People don't necessarily think of it that way, but that's why it's important to have a good quality rosin as well as good hair. And when your bow needs to be rehaired, it could be because it's just not holding on to the rosin anymore. One, you've handled it, which you shouldn't do. You should never handle it with your fingers. You get oil on the hair. It may be stretched out to the point where it just doesn't tighten properly. Or hair does kind of get old and brittle. So if you haven't practiced your violin in 10 years and you take it out of the case and you start playing, the hairs might start to break just because they're getting old. Another thing that happens to hair, though, is there's a bug that gets in there. We call them bow bugs. But if you haven't practiced it, let's say you take a month off and you leave your bow in your case and you come back and a bunch of broken hairs in your case, you probably got a bug living in your case, same kind of bug that might eat sweaters. That's horsehair. Normally the hair is white and it comes from white horses, but sometimes bass players and cello players prefer a little coarser, rougher hair, and that might be black, or we even do what they call salt and pepper, where we mix a little bit of black and white hair together to give a little bit more grip. Violinists tend to not use that because it can sound a little bit more scratchy maybe, but bass players, they have big fat strings and they need to have a lot of friction. So not only do they have maybe more coarse hair, but they have a very, very sticky kind of rosin that we couldn't use on a violin at all. You have to be careful around the bridge of the instrument because it is very fragile, very thin piece of wood. If you're too aggressive and you knock that over, you might break the bridge. That sound post that we've talked about before might fall over. Lots of bad things can happen. But we always say, at least I say, less is more here. You don't want to go out and buy cleaners. Certainly don't try to do anything that you think might disinfect your violin. Violins are varnished with various kinds of varnish, but most of them are very delicate, and chemicals on them can cause all kinds of problems. So we just recommend a soft cloth, and when you're done playing, you want to wipe off the strings. There again, not pressing too hard. You can thread this underneath the strings, wipe off the fingerboard. What you're going to find when you play is you're going to get a rosin from the bow. The rosin can make a real mess on the top of your instrument. So if you wipe that off, wipe off under here, and then just the whole instrument, because you probably handled it and got your hands and fingers on it, wipe it all off. We want to keep as much as possible. We want to avoid ever touching the varnish of a violin. So if you notice when I hold it by the neck and I hold it by the chin rest. You wouldn't catch me, grabbing the violin anywhere. Now when you play, of course, It's going to be against your neck, so you want to make sure, especially down here, that you wipe that off. Your hand is going to be up here, and a lot of old violins have a lot of wear on the varnish just from your hands being there. But if you can wipe that off, that helps. So if you're someone with sweaty hands, you certainly want to make extra attention to do that. The strings themselves won't last as long if your hands are sweaty and if you don't wipe them off. So that also helps to preserve the life of the strings. But yeah, just wiping it off and not using any kind of cleaners, I think, is what you should do. If it gets to a point where the rosin is not coming off, it's kind of built up, you probably should just take it somewhere and get it professionally cleaned. And that shouldn't be something that you have to do very often if you just do the normal maintenance. You know, if you feel like you need to have your violin shinier, well, you must realize that some violins are not going to shine. Not every varnish is a shiny varnish. It's kind of like paint. Some have a lot of gloss and some don't. What I wouldn't recommend is that you use the pledge from your mom's table and to try to get the varnish to shine. There are violin polishes that you can buy, and they do a pretty good job, but I still would say use those with caution, because oftentimes those polishes have oils in them, and if we don't know for certain that there are no open seams or cracks in the violin, we certainly don't want to be cleaning it with anything that might seep into an open seam or even bare wood, which would make it very difficult to varnish. So there again, if you want it to shine, and it can shine, you might want to take it to a shop and let them clean it professionally. And in the meantime, just try to keep that rosin from building up, because the rosin, when it first falls on your instrument, is just a white powder. It cleans off pretty easily. But if you let it sit there for a week or two, it actually starts to melt and kind of stick to the varnish. It becomes a lot harder to get off, and at some point, then we at the shop would have to use cleaners that we wouldn't sell to you to try to clean the rosin off your violin. You know, if you hear something strange coming out of your violin, well, maybe you should practice a little bit more, but maybe there's something wrong with the violin. So if you take it into a shop, oftentimes you'll see whoever you take it into doing something like this. And what I'm doing when I'm doing this is I'm listening for an unusual, like of a clacking sound. So if I would have an open seam along the edge of the violin, that violin is probably going to buzz, especially on certain notes that excite that part of the instrument. The other thing that can cause a problem, if the chin rest and the tailpiece are touching one another, so I might tap on the tailpiece like this, and if I hear a rattling sound, the chin rest has probably gotten moved. You could even have where, if you have fine tuners on your violin, where they might be touching the top of the violin, or maybe they only touch the top of the violin when you put a little bit of pressure on with your chin. So we look for things like that. There's a lot of things that might buzz on a violin. Not too many things that you could take care of yourself, though, especially if you see an open edge. And we might ask the question, why would you have an open edge on your violin? Well, violins are glued together with a kind of glue that's very weak and very brittle, and when the tension builds up in the wood, which it's going to do from season to season, because the wood of the violin either shrinks or expands depending on the season, what we don't want to have happen is for your instrument to end up with a crack down the top. So if the tension builds up, what we would love to have happen is for the edge to come unglued. That releases the tension on the top. We're going to glue it together with the same kind of weak glue that it was glued together in the first place, and we've avoided a very expensive repair and a crack that might devalue an instrument. Now, people will come back and say, well, you just glued this up last year and it came unglued again. I say, great, that's exactly what was supposed to happen, because obviously your environment changes so much from humid to dry that your instrument's building up a lot of tension. So if it keeps coming unglued, well, that's not a bad thing. Now, there are cases where there might be something, maybe you cleaned it when you shouldn't have cleaned it with some sort of polish, and we got some oil in a seam or in a crack. That might be something that we don't want to have happen over and over again. We might have to actually take the top off and figure out what's going on there. But most of the time, it's a small opening. We glue it up, and you're good to go. Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of VIVO edu. If you have any questions, feel free to call the Loft Violin Shop, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.